Hello, and welcome to the Dissident Mama podcast. Today, my guest is Marshall L. DeRosa. DeRosa is a retired professor of political science, Florida Atlantic University. He received his PhD and MA from the University of Houston and his BA from West Virginia University. His research interests include American jurisprudence, federalism, law, and American society. He is also the founder and director of the Civics Education Project. Welcome, sir.
Thank you, Rebecca. Thanks for the opportunity.
Yes, this has kind of been a long time in the making, and I want to apologize in advance. I have been fighting the croup, so my voice is a little cracky, but we are going to go ahead with Mr. DeRosa, who is so kind to be here with us today, and I have so many questions for him. So before we get into some of your many works, which are all, I could do an interview on each topic you've done, but I'm going to try to pull them all together. Before we get into your works, so the topics you write about are not, very fashionable and probably not the easiest path for somebody to forge down in academia. So how did you become a lost causer?
Wow. I don't think it's a lost cause because I think there's a resurgence on the principles that I wrote about specifically regarding the Confederacy because it has a permanency to it. And it might have stages where it seems defeat's inevitable. But when you look at the trajectory of political, historical development, as long as man wants to be free, these principles will survive. Maybe not in our time, but I can talk about some, cracks in the armor of the opposition where these principles are reemerging. But back to your original question, uh, I grew up in Fairmont, West Virginia, and I went to a parochial school, and about half a block away from the school and the church, on top of the hill, was a old southern sort of a plantation, not on the grand scale, but it was Francis Pierpont, provisional governor of Virginia, first governor of West Virginia, 1863. And the town I grew up in had a really interesting history from its during the war between the states. It was primarily I guess you could say, a Confederate, sort of the borderline between Union and Confederate sympathizers in the soon-to-be state of West Virginia. But I always just liked politics, influenced from my parents, my mom, my dad. I always had an interest in it insofar as in my undergraduate career, was going to become an attorney, but a professor said, "Hey, you're pretty good at this." So he said I should apply to graduate school. And I applied to, I don't know, maybe 7 different schools. And I picked University of Houston. It was like ranked #1 in the country, the department was at the time. And I was just a small town guy from West Virginia. And I said, wow, Houston, Texas. And so I went there. I didn't plan on staying. I just said, I'll try this for a year, have a good time. And was going to go back to my original plan to go to law school at WVU. But I kind of liked it. It grew on me. Had two great professors there, Robert Lentz and Donald Lutz. So, I've been told I was the first one to get through the doctorate program in about 7 years. And the success isn't due to my skills or intelligence. It's just that I didn't give a damn. I was hoping they'd flunk me out so I'd go to law school. uh, but I stumbled onto the Confederacy because I was interested in federalism. And Dr. Lentz was a Calhoun scholar. So that was sort of my entry into the Confederacy.
Okay. Now, your interest is in federalism. That's one of your many interests. Can you tell people what the difference between the anti-federalists and the federalists are? Because this is something when I'm a homeschool mom and I'm hanging out with homeschool moms that know a lot about a lot of things, but they're kind of wishy-washy about the Constitution, and many of them definitely get the War of Northern Aggression wrong. So what is a Federalist and what is an anti-Federalist, and how does it relate to federalism?
Well, from the perspective of 2023, the Federalists and Anti-Federalists would be on our side in all probability, with the exception of a few prominent Federalists, because they were both, for the most part, uh, pro-liberty. But the difference was that the Federalists were the ones who wanted to move away from the principles of the Articles of Confederation to a new constitution. So they played that trick in Philadelphia where we're supposed to amend the Articles of Confederation. That's our first constitution. And they just kind of threw it out the window and wrote a new one. So the Federalists wanted a stronger national government. And there are, some rational reasons why that was the case. The Anti-Federalists were the actual Federalists, but they were tagged as anti, play of words by their opponents. They were more pro states' rights. And the thing to remember is that we shouldn't romanticize government at either the state or the national level, now or then. Uh, the state governments at that time were pretty, inefficient, and or when I say inefficient, I mean there was this, traceable elements of corruption. You'll find that in any government. So the Federalists said the articles aren't working. We have war debts. The states aren't contributing. We have no control over them. They're going their own way. So they came up with the Constitution of ratified in 1789, drafted in 1787. But it was still a Federalist document. Now Lincoln and the rest of them said that no, it moved towards a unitary system, and it did implicitly, but not explicitly. They would take something like the preamble to the Constitution where it says, "We the people of the United States." But initially, that preamble read, "We the people of the states," and it listed each state. It, it the Committee on Detail, they had to revise that, or at least they thought they did, because they didn't know which states were going to ratify. So, for example, they didn't want to have Rhode Island in there if Rhode Island didn't ratify the Constitution, and it didn't ratify it until the early 1790s. So it was still a Federalist document in principle and in fact, with much more national power than under the Articles of Confederation. Nowhere near what the national government has today, absolutely not. So the way it was changed, if we look at it through the lens of 2023, the change came about not by amendments, but by American jurisprudence. The court is the one that changed the Constitution, primarily through Article 1, Section 3 of the Commerce Clause, where they empowered the Congress under its commerce powers to more or less take over the states insofar as regulating commerce. And in large measure, it's all about commerce and economics. So the Anti-Federalists, the short of it is, more pro-states' rights. The Federalists, more inclined towards a stronger national government. For example, they wanted a national bank. That was a big issue within the Washington administration that led to the falling out between the main players, Hamilton, Adams, Jefferson, Madison, and so on.
So if the flaws of government can't really be gotten rid of totally, right? So the Constitution is supposed to mitigate that. I think you have talked about the fatal sequence before. Is that just saying that instead of fixing the articles, it like opened up a Pandora's box for more power and plunder? Would you say that?
Well, I would say that the Constitution is a fine document. Don't get me wrong. as was the Articles of Confederation. But government in principle is problematical. You
Okay.
know, it's just it attracts a certain class of people that contemporary literature might say are sociopathic, or they're just power driven. But it's primarily, I don't want to blame the leadership, and this is where the fatal sequence comes in. It's the people. And everybody at the time, in the latter part of the 18th century, said this is an experiment.
Mm-hmm.
The people have to have the virtue to be self-governing. And once they lose that virtue, then the psychopaths, sociopaths are going to take over. And I think we see that today in the administrative state and the current administration. It's not the failure of the Constitution. It's a failure of the American people
Okay.
to live up to the responsibility to make sure the Constitution is adhered to by their so-called elected officials.
All right, so let's get into, you've written two books, if I'm correct, on the Confederate Constitution. The Confederate Constitution of 1861, An Inquiry into American Constitutionalism. I have that one, but I do not have this one, Redeeming American Democracy, Lessons from the Confederate Constitution. So I want to talk about the constitutionalism of it and what's in it, and then we'll talk about whether or not you think the Southern people had the virtue to make it work had they won the war. So you assert that the primary cause of the war wasn't about economics or slavery, but constitutionalism. So the Confederate Constitution, to my understanding, carried decentralization further than the original, but added some features. Can we talk about some of those features? What was clarified? What was codified? What were some of the fixes, the big ones that you think would have made that a more successful constitution, or did make it one that just wasn't?
Let me take a step back,
Okay.
Rebecca, as far as the title of that the one book, Redeeming American Democracy.
Mm-hmm.
Because what I get from people is, look, dummy, it's a republic, not a
Yeah.
democracy. But they're the dummies, because the whole system was based upon what we would call subsidiarity. The government was supposed to be primarily at the local level, which is the only place where you could have a democratic process, sort of the Jeffersonian ward principle. So most of the governing would be localized, where the people would be within reach of their government, could have meaningful input, and they would run their own lives insofar as keeping government in control. Some might do it well, some communities, some might not do it so well. But that's what, government based upon the consent of the governed is. So democracy, in order to recover those principles of 1776, this is where decentralization comes in, the government has to be close to the people. And so, yes, it is a republic insofar as the national government, and maybe even, the scheme of representation, state governments. But most of the governing was supposed to be localized. And the only way to redeem American democracy is to realize that we have to localize these things. And I'm not naive. I know some county commissions, local governments today are just as bad as the national government or state governments. But that's because most of the governing is from the top down, not from the bottom up. So redeeming American democracy means governing from the bottom up. And the national government would be very small. The state government would be an intermediary between the national and the local governments. But you can't have, quote, if it's even, desirable, you can't have a democratic, i.e., government grounded in the consent of the governed without it being localized. There's no way, absolutely impossible, to have a democracy in a country of over 330 million people. And now they're talking about a democracy on the global scale of
Right.
over 7 billion, close to 8 billion people. This is nuts. And as Thucydides says, wrote, whoever controls the language controls the politics. So people think, oh, we have a democracy in America. No, we don't have a democracy. We don't even have a republic anymore for, a variety of reasons. What we have is sort of an administrative state that claims to be democratic based upon the consent of the governed. And the people like it that way, apparently, because they're not doing anything about it. So the decentralization is key. It's not a panacea. It's difficult to be a self-governing individual. It all boils down to, if you go back to the Declaration and the unalienable rights, in the words of the Declaration, um, every man a king, as Huey Long said. The individual's the sovereign. That's where freedom resides, in the individual, not in the collective, not in the state, not in the national. And we have government only for those purposes, as Bastiat, wrote, to protect us against aggression against our fundamental rights, life, liberty, and property. So it's not a misnomer to say redeeming American democracy, because you can't have a republic without a functioning democratic process at the local level. And that's decentralization. And when it came to the Confederacy, um, they were alert to this. They were, in the words of Bastiat, being plundered, not to the extent that people are being plundered today, but they could see the handwriting on the wall. They certainly, anybody who's honest about the process realizes that the fiscal policy of the government in the antebellum period was a bad deal for the Southern states. So they wanted out. They seceded, just like the colonies seceded from Great Britain, actually the states. Uh, so secession was an implicit constitutional prerogative of the states. It was taught at West Point. Everybody accepted it. Northern states, Midwestern states threatened it. The Hartford Convention, for example, they were serious about it as a result of the economic impact of the embargo resulting from the War of 1812. So there's so much misinformation and disinformation. But the Confederacy more or less understood that things were not going in the right direction. And as a consequence, I'll give you an example, Rebecca. So, for example, there's no mention of the divine in the United States preamble. Mm-hmm. So prior to in the antebellum period, especially in New England, there were religious movements such as Transcendentalism that were denying the divinity of Christ. And so let me just read the Confederate preamble. We, the people of the Confederate States, each acting in its sovereign and independent character, straight out of the Articles of Confederation, in order to form a permanent, not perfect, but permanent federal government. And these are this is legalese that either party could end the agreement at any time. It just means sort of like in perpetuity until somebody says there's a breach of compact or contract, they could get out. In other words, they didn't have to go on an annual basis and agree again that they're going to be united in this confederacy. And it continues, establish justice, ensure domestic tranquility, and secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity, invoking the favor and guidance of Almighty God to ordain and establish this Constitution for the Confederate States of America. So that's a major sort of deviation. In the U.S. preamble, everything I just read in the Confederate was implicit. But the plundering, the politics was making it questionable. So the Confederate framers said, okay, let's make explicit what was implicit in the U.S. preamble. So that's just let me reiterate, each state acting in its sovereign and independent character. That means the states are sovereign. And sovereign means that sort of above the law, above the Constitution, they could discontinue the association, any state in the Confederacy, based upon a process that is agreed to by the other members of the Confederacy. So uh, nobody except for maybe some hardcore Federalists, in the Philadelphia Convention of 1787 would quibble with this. Because if they did, if they said, no, you're not sovereign, no, you're not independent, no, we're not going to include the divine, there's no way in hell the Constitution would have been ratified. Absolutely not. It was a close call as written. So, just in the preamble, they're setting the stage. Hey, look, the states are in charge here. They represent the people of the respective jurisdictions. And if we decide this isn't working out, it's bye-bye, just like in 1776. I mean, this is what, if a government's based upon the consent of the governed to keep a state within a union at the point of a bayonet, that's not consent.
Right.
That's tyranny. So
So
that's just one example.
yeah, keep going. Do you have another one?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
This is in Article 1, Section 2 of the Confederate Constitution. It reads, the House of Representatives shall choose their Speaker and other officers and shall have the sole power of impeachment, except that any judicial or other federal officer resident and acting solely within the limits of any state may be impeached by a vote of 2/3 of both branches of the legislature thereof. So what that means, you get a Confederate judge that's disliked, they don't like his rulings, the state legislature, by a 2/3 vote, can impeach him. Then it goes to the Confederate Senate. And the Confederate Senate, and this is before the direct election of senators, so if the senators didn't do what 2/3 of the state legislature did, he's gone. Convict. But look, I mean, just think if the state of Florida had the power to impeach federal officials operating within the jurisdiction of the state of Florida. That not only would put a chill on their behavior, but send a message. You're here at our invitation. We could rescind that invitation. Another one is, this is in Section 7, the president may approve any appropriation and disapprove any other appropriation of the same bill. In such case, he shall, in signing the bill, designate the appropriations disapproved and shall return a copy of such appropriations with his objections to the House in which the bill shall have originated. In the same proceeding shall then be had as in other case of other bills disapproved by the president. So in other words, the president can line item veto.
Wow.
Another one, Section 8, the Congress shall have the power to lay and collect taxes, imposts, and excises for the revenue necessary to pay the debts, provide for the common defense, and carry on the government of the Confederate States. But no bounty shall be granted from the Treasury, nor shall any duties or taxes on importations from foreign nations be laid to promote or foster any branch of industry. And all duties, imposts, and excises shall be uniform throughout the Confederate States. What that means, no protective tariffs. So you can't have, and this is really free market insofar as the consumer decides. So whenever a tariff is put on foreign automobiles, foreign textiles, foreign steel, foreign agriculture, that's plunder. They say, okay, we're doing it to protect jobs in, the United States. But why don't they be honest about it? It's a cost to the consumer.
Mm-hmm.
They're taking money out of the pocket of the consumer, denying the consumer choice in which products to buy, and putting it in the pockets of established, politically connected businesses, not to mention labor unions. So you can make an argument for protectionism, maybe on national security issues and things like that. Um, but we have to be, the Confederacy wasn't buying it. Another one says Congress shall also have the power to prohibit the introduction of slaves from any state not a member or territory belonging to this Confederacy. So, in other words, the Congress could keep the northern states, which was very racist, from sending slaves into the Confederacy. And this is an important one. Congress shall appropriate no money from the Treasury except by a vote of 2/3 of both houses, taken by yeas and nays, unless it be estimated for by some one of the heads of the departments submitted to Congress by the President, or for the purpose of paying its own expenses and contingencies, or for the payment of claims against the Confederate States by the justice for which have been judicially declared by a tribunal for the investigation of claims against the government, which it is hereby made the duty of Congress to establish. So, in other words, the secession wasn't going to be, we're gone. The secession was, okay, if you have a claim against us because you had federal lands or such, let's litigate it and see what it is. But for money to be spent in the appropriation process, it took a 2/3 vote, not a majority vote, unless a member from cabinet member from the executive branch supported the bill. So that would certainly have put a halt on all this crazy spending. And right after that, every law or resolution having the force of law shall relate to but one subject, and that shall be expressed in the title. No omnibus bills, no 2,000-page bills put on the speaker's desk and the members haven't even read it.
Right.
So every bill, not only does it have to, it's taking money out of the Treasury, have a 2/3 vote, but it's going to be voted not in these huge bills with all kind of riders and pork and everything stuffed into it. Let the legislation stand on its own merits. Don't tuck it in some 2,000-page bill that nobody finds out about until after it's passed.
Man.
So they also
so
didn't
great.
allow, pardon me, and here's another one. This is in the Confederate Constitution. All bills appropriating money shall specify in federal currency the exact amount of each appropriation and the purposes for which it is made. And Congress shall grant no extra compensation to any public contractor, officer, agent, or servant after such contract shall have been made or such service rendered. So the defense contractor can't say, we'll build an F-36, it's going to cost how many billions? Oh, I'm sorry. They come back and say, we need more money. And then they get the additional funds. No, if they say they're going to provide an F-36 for a specific price, that's a contract. That's what they pay. So here's another one, Article 2. The executive power shall be vested in a president of the Confederate States of America. He and the vice president shall hold their offices for the term of 6 years, but the president shall not be re-eligible. So one term, 6 years, you're out of there.
Wow.
None of this FDR. You remember, this is prior to the amendment of the Constitution. In the U.S. Constitution, originally, they could be president for life. They just set the pattern of the 2 terms until FDR, arrived on the scene.
Right.
But one term, that's it. 6 years. If you can't get it done in 6 years, that's your problem. And remember, all this is before the federal income tax. The U.S. government didn't, they didn't even have the money. It was before the Federal Reserve. It was
Right.
prior to the direct election of U.S. senators. So even in 1861, the South, the Southern leaders were clairvoyant enough to say, hey, the trajectory is towards tyranny. And if this Constitution had been in effect, um, it would be, uh, we wouldn't have the problems we have today financially.
Right.
Another one is, and this kind of, it says, no slave or other person held to service or labor in any state or territory of the Confederate States under the laws thereof, escaping or lawfully carried into another state, shall, in consequence of any law or regulation therein, be discharged from such service of labor, but shall be delivered up on the claim of the party to whom such slave belongs, or to whom such service or labor may be due. Now, what this tells us is several things. First of all, that the Confederacy was going to expand. This is what had William Seward so concerned. And that's why he tried to broker a deal with Davis and other Southern leaders to build a transcontinental railroad in the South and the North, i.e., London, in other words. But what it says is that they anticipated and did not object to free states, even within the Confederacy itself, even the six original states. There were only six states originally in the Confederacy. They anticipated that slavery would be ended. It wasn't in perpetuity. Mm-hmm. And they just said, well, if you're going to be a free state, you still have to return the property of, quote, those who own slaves. But this, makes very clear that the Confederate Constitution was not written to lock down slavery forever and ever and ever. These were rational people. They understood that slavery was not only a moral problem, a political problem, and a constitutional one. But so they anticipated that slavery was going to be dealt with in a much more, humane factor process than what actually happened. So this is one thing your listeners need to be aware of. Mm-hmm. The Confederacy would have probably ended slavery, and I'm writing a book about this, looking at case law and such in the Confederate Supreme Courts in the various states. Slavery was on, in its death throes. Probably the last state to relinquish would be, has a lot to do with demographics, would be South Carolina. Mm-hmm. But certainly Virginia, North Carolina, Alabama, the South did not fight to preserve slavery. That is such a fraud. And anybody who believes that, man, they'll believe anything.
Now, do people say that because the Constitution didn't come out right and say, we're banning this institution? They simply put it back to where the U.S. Constitution did, right? In the place of each state deciding what it wanted to do as a sovereign, correct?
Right, and that goes, absolutely, that's correct. Because the thing about slavery in the southern states, I'm no apologist for slavery, but I'm going to put the facts on the table. How should I put this? The courts recognized the humanity of the slave. For example, in capital felony cases, court after court stated, because it's such a serious offense, that the slave has the same rights as a white person. And case after case, the courts, state Supreme Courts within the Confederacy, overthrew convictions of convicted slaves due for execution on technical grounds, like, a flawed indictment, not clear instructions to the jury, all sorts of things. And who was representing these slaves in the South? White attorneys.
Right.
And I've read cases, and the there's no question these people that were the ones that made it up to the courts were guilty. Their fellow blacks, free and slave, with in some instances the primary witnesses. But on technicalities, their convictions were overturned. And like I said, they had the same rights as a white person in capital felony cases. So I'm not saying slavery was, not a horrible thing, and there wasn't a lot of miscarriage of justice, not only for slaves, free blacks, whites. That's just the criminal justice system we have today.
Right.
I mean, I work in the Department of Corrections with the Civics Education Project. And I can tell you right now, most of them are black, and they're being railroaded by uh, prosecutors, judges, not all, but a lot. They're being over sentenced, white and black. And the system's not much, people might think, oh, due process, we got it right. No,
Right.
absolutely not.
Well, let's talk about a little bit more about some of the civil case law. First, I had a question. You were mentioning juries within the Confederacy. Did you say that there were blacks and whites on juries? That would be my first
No,
question.
no, 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 not white, not blacks.
Okay.
But what I'm saying, the defendants were black
Yeah.
and
Okay.
slaves.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yes.
Okay.
And I was referring to criminal cases because
I see.
technically slaves couldn't own property. So
Okay.
go back to this is an important distinction. Sometimes it's difficult to grasp because it seems not to make sense. But the slave owner did not own the slave.
Mm-hmm.
He owned the slave's
The
labor.
labor.
But
Right.
because they were inseparable, he de facto owned the slave. But the slave, even though many of them did, and they bought their freedom, and they owned slaves, um, didn't have property.
Right.
So in misdemeanors, non-capital felony cases, they couldn't be fined because they didn't own anything, or at least they weren't supposed to. And that's when they used admiralty law, just like the Navy and the military at the time. They used physical punishment. Now, I'm not saying, there weren't a lot of racists and miscarriages of justice, so on and so forth. That happens today. It happened then. It's happened throughout human history. But the important thing is when you talk about chattel property, the slave was not on the same level as livestock. They were
Right.
human beings. Everybody realized it. Everybody recognized it. And that was the conundrum they were in because they were Christian people.
Right.
And they knew slavery was, at least subconsciously, that slavery, even though the Southern clergy, went to biblical texts that say, slavery, be a good slave, so on and so forth. Uh, but a decent person, even if you had a slave, many of this, the vast majority of Southerners did not own slaves. A small percentage owned, 10, 20, 1,000. But most of them were that other 30%, maybe owned two or three slaves, and they were members of the family by all, intents and purposes.
Right.
Um, and, a lot of this has to do, it's very complex, and I don't want to, bore your audience with this, but it's any rational human being realizes, the humanity of slaves. Now, that leaves a lot of other questions begging insofar as should they be members of the community and
Right.
so far and have political rights. That's different. That's just a completely different question. But I'm not going to get into that.
Before we move on, I want to ask you about the Confederacy's their treaties with the five civilized tribes of Native Americans. But I think one of the things I've heard you talk about before that I would like you to tell my listeners about is the Mississippi case of Josephine, because I think that speaks to exactly what you were just saying about human rights versus political rights and that type of thing.
Well, there's no question Josephine was guilty of homicide. Absolutely not. But and most of the witnesses against her were fellows slaves and a couple free blacks. And her conviction was overturned. Now, remember, this is all happening during the war.
Mm-hmm.
So they're still trying to keep their criminal justice system functioning while they're under, serious attack by an enemy. And her conviction was overturned on an indictment. I didn't get there's no record as to what happened after she was granted a new trial. I don't know if they, continued to prosecute her in the criminal courts, or they just say, hey, the world's falling apart. She kind of slipped through the cracks.
Right.
And insofar as the Native Americans, um, there were non-voting Native Americans in the Confederate Congress, and they were told that they would be given the territory, which is now Oklahoma, that would be their state. Now, think about this: non-whites given a state and a member of the Confederacy. That doesn't sound like, hardcore racism to me.
Right.
And they treated the Native Americans much better than, the postbellum Union Army.
Right.
Where, Tecumseh Sherman's comment was his only regret is that he didn't kill every last Indian.
So I think you had said before
Remember,
that
Tecumseh Sherman was president of LSU before the war. You go into the rare book room, his portrait's in there. When
I
was
didn't know
teaching,
that.
well, when I was teaching there, they had a big portrait of Sherman, and it said president of LSU. I forget the years, but
Huh.
maybe it was postbellum, antebellum. I don't know.
That's wild. So I've heard you say before that the circumstances to how the CSA Constitution was written and codified matters. Why do the circumstances matter so much?
Well, when you think about the circumstances that, the Confederacy was trying to survive, let me see if I could pull something up here real quick. Mm-hmm. It's in the manuscript that I'm working on. See if I can find it. I'll just read it if I can. Okay, this is in the introduction to this book I'm writing. The circumstances under which the Confederacy was launched is not inconsequential. To disregard those circumstances would be like judging the quality of a chef's cooking while the kitchen is ablaze and eventually burns to the ground prior to the presentation of the intended prepared meal. The best that could be done to access the chef's is to access the chef's cookbook and speculate. Confederate case law is an important chapter in the cookbook. This approach to the Confederacy requires both magnanimity and discernment. So, in other words, some of these cases were recorded. There was a paper shortage. So they were writing court records on wallpaper that they would take out of homes just to have paper. So we can't judge the Confederacy like some nitwits do and say they were fighting for slavery. Slavery would be with us today if the Confederacy survived. As a matter of fact, I heard there's a movie being made to that effect.
Right.
Netflix.
Another one. I'm sure it's been made 10 times already, but yeah.
Yeah.
We need another one.
That's essentially it. I mean, think about the circumstances. Judges, clerks, bailiffs going off to fight a war. The enemy's at the front door. and you're trying to give people their rights. You're trying to have a functioning political system, while at the same time fighting a horrendous war, a well-equipped enemy, an enemy with, vengeance and hate being perpetrated against you. So the circumstances are very important. Now, consider this scenario that the Republicans in 1861, Lincoln, for example, said that, okay, secession is a constitutional right. Go your own way. Good luck. Maybe we could, you know, get back together sometime once we figure things out. Uh, and so you have the states, the Confederacy, operating in peacetime. I'm not saying it's going to be, a panacea for good government. I don't think there really is such a thing. And that's where the fatal sequence comes in. And the
Yeah.
reason why it's not a good thing is because the fatal sequence essentially says you have oppression, then revolution, then independence, then prosperity, then lethargy. And that lethargic stage, the people lose their capacity to be self-governing. They're too busy being whatever they are. But the people that are interested in power and plunder, they get control through rhetoric and manipulation and, working the system. That's when oppression re-enters. So it's sort of a stage. And so the Confederacy, in my opinion, would have been a much better system insofar as securing the principles of 1776, but they never had a chance. They were fighting a brutal war against all the odds. Um, and I'll give you your listeners another example because I read Francis Pierpont. He's the guy that had that house in Fairmont where I grew up. So I read some of his, diary and such. And when he was also, like I said, the provisional governor of Virginia when the war broke out, and he was running as operating in Wheeling, West Virginia, being the pretended governor of Virginia that has seceded from the Union.
Mm-hmm.
But he said when Lee was trapped in Richmond, this was around 1863, and Lincoln started to move troops into the Mississippi Valley. So he goes to Washington, and these are my words, not his, saying more or less, "Are you nuts? Lee's trapped. The war's won." And the reply from the Lincoln administration is this. Now, you have to let this sink in. He agreed with Pierpont, the administration did, that the war is won militarily. But the response was, he promised his supporters the war would last at least another 2 years.
Hmm.
Why? Plunder. Think Ukraine. Think
Yeah.
Iraq. Plunder. Think of the people that died, North and South, so the elite could line their pockets. And when they were in the Mississippi Valley, Union generals were exchanging weapons for cotton to get to the New England textile mills. There's just like, them blowing up the pipelines that the Russians were supplying.
Mm-hmm.
People don't know the truth. So when the Nord Stream pipelines were blown up, Seymour Hersh just wrote an article about this. The Americans did it. The Americans blew up the pipelines. Why? Hegemony. They were the empire is hegemonic. They didn't want Germany to be too closely economically tied with Russia because they would lose part of their empire. So they, with the help of Norway, according to Seymour Hersh, they blew up Nord Stream pipelines 1 and 2. It's in the New York Times. He puts it all on the table. So they demonize Putin. They claim he blew up the pipelines when it was the United States government.
Right.
So, is and in Ecclesiastes, that's nothing changes. There's nothing new under the sun. That's the nature of politics. And what they really dreaded about the Confederacy has nothing to do with slavery, but that it was going to be growing up through the Mississippi Valley, Mexico, Cuba, the Caribbean. It was going to be a free market empire, not based upon coercion, but based upon economic exchange. And with that happening, New England, for the most part, New England would be isolated, minimized, and lose its grip, not only on power, but on economic plunder. Does that
Well,
make sense?
yes, it does. Like it's they just didn't want a competing institution, especially one that was getting things right or improving upon things that had maybe gone stale for a while.
I mean, William Seward offered Jefferson Davis, I mentioned this before, and I
Mm-hmm.
mean, this speaks volumes. Hey, look, we'll build you a transcontinental railroad too. Both
Right.
sections could plunder.
Right. Wow. Well, this leads me to some a segue, but it's still under the same topic. So your book, The Politics of Dissolution, Quest for a National Identity and the American Civil War. So within the context of what you're talking about, the preamble to the CSA Constitution, where they're using more Christian focused language. They're speaking in what I would say is very nationalist terms, right? Borders, language, culture, faith, trying to define who they were. Do you think the South was an authentic nation? And could it have been a true civilizational force? I mean, to me, like Christianity is at the heart of civilization, and here they were trying to put that back in and not reimagine it, but I can't think of the word, just codify that more.
Well, I mean, even today, the South is known as the Bible Belt, sort of
Mm-hmm.
the remnant of, that foundation. But insofar as I wouldn't say a nation, I wouldn't describe the Confederacy as a nation, but
Mm-hmm.
as nations in league with one another, the
Ah,
plural. So each state was a nation because even in the Declaration of Independence, the last paragraph, the sovereign and independent states
mm-hmm.
in the 18th century meant nation. In the states, they say the state of Great Britain in that last paragraph. So
Okay.
when you say state, we should be thinking nation. So one way to think of it, this isn't as precise as it should be, but the United Nations today. But even within today, the United Nations, I always think of the United States today sort of in the position that South Carolina was in and the other southern states, i.e., nations, that the globalists do not like nations, just like the Republicans in 1861 did not like these states. They wanted to centralize power. This comes from that puritanical thing, going way back to the latter part of the 18th century. So the when I say that the United States, in, for example, Trump trying to protect the nation, just like governors and legislatures in the South are trying to protect their states. So a lot of the things, the pushback you see today, we've gone to the next level. And the globalists want to put an end to nations,
Mm-hmm.
i.e., states, and they want to centralize it at a transnational level whereby the elite would have total control on a global scale.
Right.
So even though when we look at it from 1861, uh, the South was doing in many ways what the anti-globalists are doing today.
Mm-hmm.
Get off our backs. Because what that those globalists are doing, and this includes the Vatican, they're saying America has it too good. The South had it too good. They need to share the wealth. America needs to share the wealth. So it's a, the United States is about 5% of the global population and consumes about 30% of the global GNP.
Mm-hmm.
And people around the world say, no, 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 you're going to redistribute that. But to do that, they're going to enrich themselves, the elites, just like the Republicans. I'll give you an example. I was reading when after Lincoln was assassinated during his funeral, a reporter went in, and the radical Republicans were at Willard's Hotel, and he's writing how they're laughing, Lincoln's gone, blah blah blah, and now they could do the radical Republican agenda and start the plundering again. Because Lincoln's a very complicated individual, and there's the early Lincoln and the latter Lincoln, and I think he came to the realization that what he unleashed was an atrocity, and he was, I think, had he survived, not been assassinated, that the postbellum period would have been much more congenial and fair in reintegrating the southern states back into the Union. But with Lincoln out of the picture, these radical Republicans, as this reporter reported, he was there, Willard Hotel, they're scheming and glad Lincoln's gone. So you could always judge a person, especially a political figure, by his true and genuine enemies. So if they wanted Lincoln out of the picture, that tells me that Lincoln was an obstacle to a certain extent. I'm not saying he wasn't a plunderer and a bad person, but he could have realized that, hey, man, I'm going to have to account for this. That's if he was a believer. That's even questionable.
Right.
But he's a human being. And, he lost his son during the war and such. And that has a profound impact on people when you lose, a child. And so maybe he did. The radical Republicans said, hey, he's not a reliable team member anymore. And, the assassination and everything else, that's another story. But don't put anything past these people.
Right.
They're after power. And anything
Yep.
that stands in their way, Katie bar the door. They're not going to tolerate it if they don't have to. And the only way to make them tolerate it is for a virtuous, informed electorate, citizens, to stand up against it. But, then and now, people have been dumbed down to the point where they don't know right from left when it comes to politics anymore.
Right. So, there's always, not always, but more in the last few years, there's talk of secession. And it's interesting. Sometimes I'm really black-pilled, but sometimes I see that nationalism is on the rise in some places. And you had talked about cracks in the armor of our opposition. Sometimes I think that the liberal international order, this whole global centralization and egalitarian socialism is just so far, like off the ledge that I don't see how it could keep going. So do you think that this could keep going on in perpetuity, or do you think that this, the transatlantic tentacles are being cut off? Do you see nationalism on the rise or the New World Order continuing on for a long time?
Yeah, that's a difficult question insofar as, what's the trajectory, what the future holds. I know these people will stop at nothing. COVID-19 is an example of that.
Mm-hmm.
One thing about, I live in the state of Florida, and it's not nullification, but it's interposition.
Mm-hmm.
The governor and the legislature interposed on the deep state's enforcement of their agenda in the state of Florida, not as much as they should have necessary, but a heck of a lot more than other states.
Right.
So, insofar as the trajectory, and I'll be honest with you, I said this. I was in the Constitution Party. I ran for the U.S. Senate, and I was going around Florida. And I was telling people, and I told them this is back in 2010 um, that this isn't normal politics. There's something devious here. And I use the word, it's a war of principalities, between principalities. And this is my own view. You might think I'm nuts, but there's a satanic element to this
Mm-hmm.
that you've seen it in pagan times, um, but that is really, it's sort of covert. You could see now you're a homeschooler in the state of Florida. I mean, think about this. When DeSantis was elected, he won that election by about 30,000 votes. And one of the ways he won it is because his opponent, Gillum, who, drug addict and, pardon my French, a sex pervert, after the election, that became clear. Um, he had to deal with the teachers union. And he said when he's elected governor, which he came very close to doing, and imagine Governor Gillum during COVID-19, he said he's going to close down charter schools and go after homeschoolers. So when he said he was going to close down charter schools, uh, the African American ministers in South Florida and North Florida rallied their congregations, and that was the difference in the election because charter schools get choice, and they're
Right.
much better than government schools. And if it weren't for that, we'd have Governor Gillum during COVID-19.
Wow.
And if we had Governor Gillum, we'd be, in the state of Florida living under a tyranny,
Right.
unless the legislature did something to stop him. So, there is hope insofar as in certain states, some states are lost. California, maybe New York, looks like Pennsylvania. Um, but there are some states where the leadership and the people have enough backbone to stand up against tyranny. And that's what it is. And it's not only fiscal tyranny, it's spiritual tyranny.
Yeah.
You look at the LGBT plus and all that stuff. This is nuts. What gender are you? I don't know. Tell me. Okay. We think you were born this way, but we could surgically fix you so you feel more comfortable this way. The world's gone mad with that. And people are putting up with this, not here in the state of Florida and other states, but in some states they are. This is child abuse, child mutilation. And think about abortion. Some states, not only abortion up to the term of delivery, but postnatal abortions, 6 months after birth. Governor Northam in Virginia, for example. Virginia, a southern state. Um, so we're in a heap of trouble, and it's not going to be solved by politics. And, you probably read it too. Hobby Lobby and evangelicals endorsing open borders and LGBT plus. What in the hell? Evangelicals.
Right.
Deep doo-doo.
Right.
And look, I'm a Catholic. Look at the Vatican and our so-called Pope. So there's something, in the air uh, that is metaphysical. So we're under assault. But who's leading the charge on the other side? I know, and I say it has satanic fingerprints all over it.
So if we would retaliate through law, how would we do that besides interposition and possibly nullification or secession? if there could be a peaceful secession, how would we retaliate through this?
We'll
To
have to
this,
be
I mean.
careful here because I'm sure the DHS is listening and the FBI and the CIA and everybody else.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, so I wouldn't use the word necessarily retaliate. I would use the phraseology, how do we protect our fundamental rights? And that's the right within a federal structure um, to have our God given rights, to be protected against aggression against those rights. Um, and the best way to do it is, in my opinion, on an individual basis. So when I'm in the prisons and the inmates, most of them are, after they hear the truth, they have an epiphany and a transformation. That's why I was under attack in 2018 and they try to have me fired from my position. Um, but during COVID, the state university system offered a buyout. It was, pretty good. I was going to retire anyway, so I took it. But insofar, what I tell the inmates is, look, you're not going to change the world. Change yourself. That's the best you could do. And with your interaction with other people, then slowly you could be an example to them. So insofar as where we are historically speaking, one thing we do have are these God-given rights: life, liberty, pursuit of happiness, properly understood. Um, just start with the individual from the
Mm-hmm.
ground up, and then from the individual to the neighborhood to the community to the state. But what's really disappointing, we don't have our sort of protectorate, and that would be the church, whether you're a Protestant, a Catholic, a Jew, or a Muslim. Where are the religious leaders?
Mm-hmm.
Because if you think of the American Revolution, the revolution never would have happened if it weren't, it was organized from the pulpit.
Right.
So until we get the church, the clergy, to do what they were charged to do, stand up for biblical principles, stand up to the point of being thrown in jail and even executed. Because when you think about the eschatology of a Christian, this life is a flash in the pan.
Right.
This is in our kingdom. Our kingdom is to come, and we're going to be judged. And it's so I would start with that. Hold on to your faith. Don't capitulate an inch when it comes to principles of faith. Be ready to be thrown into prison and even killed, not only by the government, but by maniacs out there in society. Stand up for the Second Amendment. Never give up your arms, your weapons. Never.
Mm-hmm.
This sounds like crazy talk, but you asked, so I'm telling you what I think.
Yeah. And when we first started talking about the Confederate Constitution, well, constitutions in general, it requires a virtuous people, and what you're speaking about is virtue. So instilling virtue in the individual, and then from there it goes out. And you had written a book called The Enduring Relevance of Robert E. Lee, the ideological warfare underpinning the American Civil War. And I've been saying for a long time, it's not because Robert E. Lee owned slaves that he is so viscerally attacked. It's because he was virtuous and he was God-fearing, and he, even though was a man of action, I think tended to the plank in his own eye first before he ever did anything. And I think that is what enrages the progressives, because he had something tangible and beautiful and real, and progressives, of course, have none of that. Can you tell us a little bit more about why you think Robert E. Lee, his relevance is so enduring, and then we'll end it on that?
Well, first of all, I know it's relevant because he's under attack.
Yeah, good
And
point.
why is he under attack? Okay, let's assume Robert E. Lee freed his slaves. Has anybody asked the slaves if they wanted to be freed?
Mm-hmm.
What were they going to be free to enter into? And another thing I found out, this is going to really, you know, you fall out of your chair. This just shows you how we live in this surreal world. Legally, slavery never existed in America because when you trace the origins of slavery, all they had was a receipt of sale. And that could be traced back to an execution and fraud because the first people that were enslaved in Africa, you don't know, did they consent to being enslaved? Probably not. It was forced upon them. That's execution and fraud, which means whoever claims ownership then or subsequently didn't have legal title to the slave. Mm-hmm. So I mean, you're talking about fraud rights. And execution and fraud is essentially you can't come up with a phony document and claim it to be a contract. A sales receipt is not a contract because the other party, a human being, there's no evidence he, she, and certainly not their posterity agreed to it. So technically, slavery is a mirage. It's in the minds of people. And insofar as Lee and slaves and other people who owned slaves, many of whom in the Southern leadership were abolitionists, but what the hell were you going to do with the slaves?
Right.
It was socialism from the cradle to the grave. And as Fitzu wrote, Cannibal's All in 1850, and Genovese wrote the same thing, and Roll Jordan Roll, the slaves had a better life based upon census data than the factory workers in New England. Mm-hmm. Better diets, better living conditions, better body weight, longer life expectancy. So when a slave, and this is in all the southern states, could no longer work or be productive, it was the responsibility of the slave, quote, owner to care for them. And that's sort of a socialism from the cradle to the grave. And when you read a lot of this, they paint, they give you the worst examples of slavery. And believe me, I'm no apologist for slavery. But I would say this. Did anybody ask the slaves if they wanted to be freed? Yes, some did. Some didn't. And I see this in the probate records. When, somebody dies intestate and they're saying, well, what do we do with the slaves? And judge after judge after judge, when there are different claims to the slave within the family, would choose the family that was best for the slave. In other words, who was going to give them the best circumstances. Now, I'm not saying slavery is, life, is tough. I don't care if you're a factory worker, a farmer, whatever. But woe is me. My great, great, great grandmother was a slave. Oh, so what? My great, 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 whatever, could have been a slave, could have been a wage slave, could have been discriminated against. This is just plunder, this reparations thing. It's plunder. Right. And that's one of the reasons I'm writing the book, to get this narrative corrected.
And what's the name of that book?
Oh, gee, it's gone through several renditions. I don't have it in front of me.
Okay.
I think the last one, because it was about 1,000 pages, mm-hmm. and trying to get it down to a couple hundred. Thanks to our mutual friend, Don Livingston.
Oh, is he helping you?
He said it's too academic.
Oh, it's for the Abbeville Press.
Yeah, maybe. I might go to an alternative.
Yeah, I write long. I'm currently writing a chapter for a book on Southern nationalism, and it's supposed to be 12 pages. I'll just say it's way more than 12 pages. So that's what I'm working on. I'll write long.
Is that for Michael or?
Say what?
Yeah, I was So I was at I gave a talk a couple of weeks ago, and
Hmm.
some guy said, Michael Tubbs said he was writing a book or something. No, not Tubbs. Somebody else was there and said he was putting together a book.
Yeah. Yeah, he's I believe he is contributing a chapter to it.
Yeah.
It's some of the guys from Identity Dixie. It's not like quote unquote associated with Identity Dixie, it's going to be separate, but it's a lot of the guys that work there are going to publish it because one of them recently wrote a book about their experience at Charlottesville, and it sold pretty well. It did really well on Amazon. So they're thinking of doing kind of a modern take on, like I'll take my stand right now. Let's talk about what Southern National is, what it is, how
Yeah.
we can go forward with it. So it's going to be 12 different people speaking to their, uh, I'm doing it through a Christian lens, so that will probably be much different than other people's, but it's
Yeah.
just to get people thinking about this, because what we're doing now ain't working. So that's why I
Yeah.
was asking you about nationalism, whether you even thought the South could be a nation and if it ever was.
Well, it was, the word nation properly understood, it was a confederation.
Yeah.
So it wasn't a unitary system. The war gave it that sort of appearance.
Right.
And it sometimes, Davis administration, just to have the Confederacy survive, had to do things he otherwise would never have done, like conscription and things like that.
Mm-hmm.
But when you think about the South, and I'm convinced of this, Rebecca, some of the southern states like Georgia did more to defeat the Confederacy or contribute to its defeat uh, than the Union Army. Because when you're fighting a war, you take a state like Georgia, the courts there were, when on the writs of habeas corpus, were taking people out of the Confederate Army and putting them in the state militias. And the governor of Georgia would not turn them over when the Confederacy needed, you know, troops. So and it's also important to remember that, and Jefferson Davis writes about this, that one third of the Confederate troops, if not more, went AWOL.
Mm-hmm.
One third, um, because, and I'm not, blaming them. When you have an agricultural society and you have crops to plant, harvest, you have your family hundreds of miles away. That's a big draw. Man, I got to get back to my wife, to my parents, to my kids.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know what's happened. They didn't have, cell phones. Hey, how you doing, honey? They didn't know what the hell was going on. So I'm thinking, if I was in, 1863 and I had a family with kids and a farm, man, that's, hey, let's get this over with. I'm getting out of here.
Right.
And it's just one of the problems of, the war. The Union didn't have as much of a problem because they used a lot of immigrants,
Right.
like the Irish. And even they got dissatisfied with it and, went AWOL. Um, so it's, I don't like to think of the Confederacy, quote, as a nation, because then we're conceding
Yeah.
something that the Confederates would not necessarily agree with. It was not a nation, but a confederacy. And, maybe the title of the book should not Southern nationalism, but Southern Confederacy.
Mm-hmm.
And when it comes to the Confederacy, uh, it doesn't only mean, at least in my opinion, the South, even though the South is unique, but still very diverse, very diverse. But it looks not as diverse when you compare it to the North. But it is diverse within its own orbit. But there are other states, and we shouldn't exclude them, that might be sympathetic to the principles that the Confederacy was adhering to. So, it was really like a reaction. When you think about the Confederacy, uh, they were the true Americans. They were reacting to developments and going back to the principles of 1776. And nobody should be excluded. If a state shares in those principles, whether it's in, Montana, one of the Dakotas, Idaho, parts of states like Western Washington, Western Oregon, invite them in. Uh, you know, get allies that stand for the same principles of 1776. So if you make it exclusionary, I think you're kind of shooting yourself in the foot because some of the southern states, or at least pockets within the South, are more aligned with the North, like Northern Virginia.
Mm-hmm.
And, other like southeastern Florida. So when you think of a state like Florida, it really has three states within a state: Southern Florida, Mid Florida, North Florida, excluding Jacksonville. So, it's Russell Kirk would say, politics of prudence. We need to be pragmatic. Where are our allies? And they're not only in the South, but some of our enemies are in the South.
Yeah, I definitely agree with that. I live in North Carolina, and there are plenty of colonized, Yankeefied, horrible cities filled with not just Yankees, but scallywags all over the state of
I
North
mean, look what
Carolina.
happened to Asheville, North Carolina.
Oh, yeah.
My
I mean,
gosh.
it's crazy. It's nuts. So yeah, politics of prudence. I will think about that as I go forward, writing my chapter that will definitely be exactly 12 pages long.
Especially when it comes to the religious dynamic,
Yeah.
Rebecca.
Mm-hmm.
Um, you have a lot of allies all over the country. It might be a county, it might be a section of a state, it might be a state.
Yeah, this is
But
true.
I would try not to be, if the theme is I'll take my stand, don't be exclusive, be inclusive.
Is the civics education project, tell us a little bit about that before we end, just because I don't know what that is until you mentioned it in your bio. Told me about it for your bio. What is that?
Well, I don't want to get my colleagues in trouble, but I'll just put it this way. I applied for a grant back in 2015 well, let me go back. My first teaching position was in West Virginia, the small liberal arts college in Elkins, West Virginia, and about 20 miles away there was a penitentiary in Huntsville, and at the time the state allowed inmates to take college courses and the state paid for it. So, newly minted PhD and all that, I said, well, I could use the extra money. So I started going to the penitentiary and I started teaching, and some of the students ended up at the college. And they were real good students. And it was a real, I really benefited from it.
Hey, Marshall, did you step away from the mic?
No, can you hear me?
Oh, now I can. You were fading in and out just a little bit. I think we heard most of it, but continue. Just stay
Yeah, I was
closer to the
leaning
mic.
back in my chair. That's
Oh. You're
um,
probably tired. We've been talking for a while. This will be the last question, I promise.
but anyhow, I went to West Virginia, did it in West Virginia, teaching in the prison. And I'm a big cyclist. I was doing a race around Lake Okeechobee here in Florida, and I saw a prison. And I said, hey, when you're cycling 120 miles, your mind opens up. Say, maybe I'll, apply for a grant and uh, have some time on my hands, and I'll teach civics at that penitentiary. And so I applied for the grant, got it, was very successful, got more grants and more, got some attention. Some other donors and colleagues got involved. So now we're in, three different states. We have a national director. And what we do is we teach what's called the quadrivium: civics, ethics, literature, and economics. and it's a
Wow.
core curriculum, and it's at a college level, and it's growing by leaps and bounds. I waiting list of hundreds of people trying to get in. So teaching classes, maybe 30 to 40 students. And when I say inmates, I'm talking about lifers, gangbangers, drug traffickers, sex offenders. And I'm not a bleeding heart, but as a Christian, Christ says, go to the prison. So I was doing my Christian responsibility. And the inmates really like it. It's been transformative. I've been an expert witness in resentencing hearings and things like that. But that's essentially what it is. Um, we go in there and we, teach, Aristotle, Hayek, Mises. I wrote a civics textbook for the inmates. Um, we have literature. They're right now reading Democracy in America. They've read Pudd'nhead Wilson. They've read some Ayn Rand, even though she's an objectionist and an atheist, but she kind of shows what a dystopia looks like. So I let them, introduce them to that. But it's really, our responsibility. It's sort of like a calling to do what Christ said to do. So when I go in there, Rebecca, this might sound corny, but I don't see the convicted felon. I try to see Christ in that. And I try to, in a very subtle way, introduce them to Christ. And I do that by focusing on the Declaration of Independence, because I could do that without, quote, preaching. But the Creator gave us these inalienable rights, and that everybody has dignity. And so one of the big thrust of the program, everybody has dignity. You are created by a creator with these rights. Everybody in this room, all these other convicted felons, have those same rights. Your victims have those same rights. You have a duty to respect the rights of your fellow citizens. And we read Bastiat. That's the first reading assignment in the civics class about
Wow.
plunder and justice and things like that. Um, but they've never heard this. They've gone to government schools. They've never, and, and this is no exaggeration, 99% of them, and I believe it, at least most of them, say had they been taught this at an earlier age, they would not have committed their crimes. Would not. And
Wow.
so it's really, I do this for the most part pro bono. I'm retired, but I'm working harder now than I did as a full professor at a major university. Um, and I started with my son, by the way, in 2015 or 2017. He worked with me on this. He became an attorney, and he was killed by a convicted felon.
Mm.
So,
Wow.
you got, and I forgave the guy because it really helped me because Christ could forgive his persecutors. And in the Our Father, we say, forgive us our trespasses as we forgive those. So it's been life changing. And that's why I made reference to Lincoln. You don't lose a son without changing.
Right.
It just opens up a whole new world. And I do it for my son Eli too, because I know he was going to be, I had him in line to be the national director, and he was real good, a real good attorney. Oh my gosh, he was only 27. So yeah, he died. He was killed. He was engaged to be married and everything. It was a real tragedy.
Oh my goodness. Well, that is just such a powerful story that I mean, you're walking the Christian walk, you're not just talking about it.
Well,
And
I'm not saying, hey, Rebecca, I'm far from, anywhere near where I should be.
aren't we all?
I just live, I don't commit crimes and things like that,
Right.
but I haven't, in the, Christian sense, been proactive enough. I was in the classroom, and I, was in my so-called quasi-public life. But we all, and if people could light that fuse and be more Christ-like and loving to their fellow man. I don't hate anybody, but I'll be damned if I'm going to sit by and watch these plunderers try to destroy our country, our civilization, and aggress against our rights. And I have nothing to lose.
Yes.
After that happened to Eli, I'm not afraid of dying.
Yeah. Yeah. Not fearing death is a very powerful weapon that Christians have. And I think that's another reason we're also under assault.
And that's why the Confederacy had that faith.
Mm-hmm.
Even in 1776, when you read about the trials and tribulations of war, wow, those were real men and women.
Yes.
I don't see much of that anymore. That's what we have to revive and recover.
Yes, absolutely. And recover is a great way to end it, because that's the goal, to recover what we've lost. And I thank you so much for your time today. And you're just a very busy person with the Civics Education Project and writing your book that's now 1,000 pages that Dr. Livingston wants you to get down to 300. So I really appreciate you taking the time and just explaining to all of us so many nuances and intricacies of history that even people who consider themselves amateur historians, we still don't know, because it's a deep well. So thank you
Well,
for
I want
coming.
to thank you, Rebecca, for your great work, and be strong and keep fighting.
All right. Well, thank you, sir. If you could pray for me, I will take all the prayers I can get, and I'll pray for you as well, sir.
I appreciate that. Will do.
All right. Thank you.
Bye.
Bye-bye.